We had war down to a science. 17 species. 400 years of combined doctrine. Battle formations refined across 11 major conflicts, each one adding another layer to the architecture of how civilizations survive each other. We knew casualty ratios. We knew supply, collapse, thresholds. We knew exactly how long a siege needed to last before psychological fracture set in. 23 days. For the Vethkai, 41 for the Dorhan, 9 for our own kind if we're being honest about it. We had numbers for everything. Then humans arrived, and I want to be very clear about what I mean when I say arrive, because they didn't come when we asked. They didn't come when the coalition filed the formal request. They didn't come when the Grintal offensive took the Kisari line, and we lost 6 orbital platforms in 11 days. They came when, I think, they decided. And the battle that had been slowly, methodically bleeding us for 3 months ended in 5 hours. In my opinion, 5. I was there. I logged every timestamp. I still don't fully understand what I watched. And I've been a tactical observer for 31 years. What follows is my account. Officially, it's filed as Incident Report 7714-C, Observer Notation, 3rd Auxiliary Fleet. Unofficially, it's a warning. Not about the humans, which about what it means that we needed them at all. The TBH, coffee was terrible again. I mentioned Thizin because it matters to what follows, but because I made a note of it in my log at 412, and I have a personal rule. If I logged it, I report it. 17 years TBH of field observation have produced some habits that my commanding officer, Legate Vron, describes as aggressively meticulous, which I describe as the only reason either of us is still alive. The coffee was terrible. The observation deck smelled like coolant from the auxiliary venting system that had been malfunctioning for 9 days. The Kisari perimeter, visible through the forward display, looked like a wound that had stopped bleeding, but hadn't closed, dark, quiet, holding. The Grintal, hadn't moved in 6 hours. This was not comfort, which the Grintal not moving meant they were thinking, and the Grintal thinking had historically preceded approximately 80% of the worst moments of my career. I logged that too. 4 horas 12 minutos y 9 segundos, Grintal static. Recommend alert escalation, which it was the 4th time I'd recommended alert escalation in 3 days. Legate Vron had approved 2 of those recommendations, declined 1, and for the 4th had simply said, in that particular tone of his that meant the decision had already been made above both of us. The humans are coming. I'd logged my response to that as well, though I edited it before submission. What I actually wrote before the edit was humans, right? The species that has held galactic standing for 11 years without fighting a single major engagement. Wonderful, which I'll alert my next of kin. What I submitted was acknowledged. Request ETA confirmation and timestamp. 4 hours, 47 minutes, and 33 seconds. They came in on the Carver. I want to describe the ship, because the ship itself was the first indicator that I was not adequately prepared for what was going to happen. Coalition vessels at our tonnage class run standard configuration. Symmetrical hull plating, forward weapon arrays in predictable formation, navigational profile. That any competent gunner in any competent fleet can read and range in about 8 seconds. The Carver didn't look like a ship that had been designed. It looked like a ship that had been argued over repeatedly by parties who couldn't agree on fundamental principles and had eventually produced a compromise that satisfied no one. The hull asymmetry was not decorative. There were visible aftermarket additions, structural reinforcements bolted across original plating, what appear to be 2 entirely different engine configurations running in parallel. There was marking on the starboard ventral section that my translator rendered as, "She runs fine, stop asking." This was, I noted, painted directly onto a military vessel's hull. I logged 4 hours, 47 minutes, and 41 seconds. Human vessel configuration non-standard. Structural coherence, unclear. Threat assessment, pending, and threat assessment pending. I'd recycle that entry about 40 times over the next 5 hours. The docking sequence was normal, which surprised me. I'd half expected them, TBH, to misread the approach vector or attempt something creatively inadvisable. Instead, the Carver settled into Bay 7 with the kind of casual competence that suggested the pilot had docked in worse conditions and found this one mildly boring. Legate Vron met them personally. I attended as his observer, which meant I stood slightly behind him, held my logging device, and tried to look professionally neutral while internally experiencing something I can only describe as a complicated anxiety I didn't have good words for in any language I spoke fluently. There were 14 of them. I don't know what I'd expected. I'd reviewed human military documentation. Idea basic, razonable anatomical, briefing. I was not expecting to be basically surprised. I was surprised anyway. Not by the way they looked, by the way they moved into the bay, loose, informal, no discernible formation, talking to each other in low voices in that layered, rapid language of theirs that my translator caught only in fragments. By the fact that 3 of them were eating something. By the way, the one at the front, their officer, I assumed, a human called Sergeant Reyes, according to the manifest, walked up to Legate Vron, looked at the full tactical display we had prepared, the 3-dimensional Grintal force mapping. We had spent 4 days compiling, and said, "That's a lot of dots." Vron, to his considerable credit, said, "Those dots represent a Grintal offensive force of approximately 42,000 units with confirmed orbital support." Reyes looked at the display for another moment. "Kind of okay," she said. "What time is it?" I logged. 4 hours, 51 minutes, and 2 seconds. Human Sergeant Reyes appears unconcerned. Uncertain whether this is confidence, pathology, or translation artifact. Timestamp: 5 hours, 14 minutes, and 20 seconds. The briefing lasted 19 minutes, which I've sat in briefings that lasted 6 hours and conveyed less information than the 19 minutes Reyes and Vron spent at that table. But the information flow was almost entirely from our side to hers. She asked questions, Vron answered, she nodded, occasionally made a note on a device she held, occasionally asked a follow-up that made Vron pause in a way that suggested the question was better than expected. She asked about the Grintal's resupply pattern. She asked whether there were any documented cases of the Grintal abandoning an offensive position voluntarily. She asked about the 3-day weather satellite window and whether the Grintal tactical AI incorporated that data or if it ran on a static model. Vron didn't know the answer to that last one. He looked at me. I checked my records. 59 minuti e 47 secondi. Grintal. Tactical AI. Architecture. Unknown. I said unknown. Reyes wrote something down. The other 13 TBH, humans weren't attending this briefing. They had asked, very politely, through a junior officer, to be taken to the equipment bay instead. 4 of them, I was told, had immediately begun modifying their own gear in ways that our bay technician described later as technically illegal in 3 coalition jurisdictions, but also kind of brilliant so. One of them had gone to sleep on a storage crate. Directly on a storage crate. In the equipment bay. During what was, by any objective measure, an active military crisis. I noted in, my opinion, this at 5 hours, 11 minutes, and 3 seconds, and then stared at it in my log for a while before moving on. Timestamp: 6 hours, 2 minutes, and 11 seconds. The Grintal moved at 6:02. Actually, not slowly. Not with the methodical progression of their standard ground doctrine. They, came across the Kesari line in a concentrated push, 3 columns, overlapping fields, the kind of formation that had taken the 6th defensive position in under an hour last time they'd used it. Our analysts had been watching for it. We had prepared a response. The response was currently losing ground, and I was on the observation deck. Vron was at the command table. The air tasted like old adrenaline and recycled oxygen, and the particular flavor of a situation becoming worse. Reyes walked onto the deck at 6:04. She had a cup of something that smelled like burned plant matter. I later learned humans called it coffee, and I noted privately that it smelled quite a bit worse than my coffee, which was already terrible, and felt an irrational and fleeting solidarity with her about this. She stood beside me, looked at the display, and watched the Grintal columns advance. "There," she said. She pointed at the gap between the 2nd and 3rd columns, a corridor of perhaps 200 meters, shifting, unstable, where the 2 formations' flanks didn't quite align. I'd seen that gap, and our analysts had flagged it. The conclusion had been that it was a trap, an intentional lure designed to draw coalition units into an enfilading position. I said, our assessment is that the gap is bait. Reyes tilted her cup, looked into it, apparently decided whatever was in there was not worth drinking, and set it down. "I guess, yeah," she said. "It is." She said nothing for a moment. "We're going in anyway." I logged 6 hours, 4 minutes, and 58 seconds. Sergeant Reyes aware trap is a trap. Intends to use trap as trap. Mechanism unclear. Requesting clarification. She had already left the deck before I finished logging it. Timestamp, 6 hours and 31 minutes. Here is what I observed from the deck between 6:04 and 6:31, in the order I logged it. 6:07, human fire teams deploy for Bay 7. 14 personnel, no heavy vehicle support, equipment load, approximately standard -2 items I couldn't identify, plus one item I later had to ask about, and was told by a human technician was insurance. 6:09, fire team split into 3 elements. 2 well, take flanking positions that, on my display, read as tactically incoherent. I log, flanking positions non-standard. Possible navigation error. This assessment was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. 6:14, first human element enters the gap between Grintal columns. This isn't, in my opinion, a subtle movement, and the Grintal register it almost immediately. 3 seconds later, the second column begins rotating to close the corridor. 6:15, I log, human element 1 inside closing corridor. Assess 73% encirclement probability within 4 minutes. I say a word under my breath that my logging device was not meant to capture. It captured it anyway. I've redacted it from a submitted report, and 6:17, the Grintal column rotates. And the 2 flanking elements, the ones I'd logged as tactically incoherent, aren't in flanking positions at all. They are exactly where the Grintal column is rotating toward. I stared at the display for a full 4 seconds before I understood what I was looking at. They hadn't flanked the gap. They had flanked the response to the gap. They had predicted not the Grintal's static position, but the Grintal's reaction. And they had placed their people not where the Grintal were, but where the Grintal were going to be. 6 hours, 18 minutes, and 44 seconds. I log. Reassessing. Flanking positions weren't navigation errors. I stood there in the coolant smell and the recycled air and watched 14 humans inside a trap that had been built for 40 times their number begin doing something I didn't have a tactical term for. I need to invent one before the night was over. Timestamp, 6 hours, 44 minutes, and 17 seconds. The gap closed. That part the Grintal got right. Corridor sealed, human element 1 encircled, exactly as designed. 40 seconds of Grintal fire concentrated on a 200-meter zone. The display showed me 4 human biosignatures in that corridor. Like active, moving, not in retreat, moving. I've observed, and I'm logging this as a statement of professional record, not hyperbole. 43 engagements across 6 conflicts. I've watched coalition units perform under encirclement conditions. The TBH behavioral pattern is documented, predictable. Units under encirclement either attempt breakout or consolidate into a defensive hold. To be fair, both options are rational. Both options are oriented around the encirclement as the primary tactical fact. Human element 1 didn't appear to have received that documentation. They weren't trying to break out. They weren't defending. They were moving into the closing formation, inward, pressing into the Grintal lines from the inside, and the 2 flanking elements were simultaneously pressing from the outside. The, in my opinion, Grintal column, which had been a clean rotational maneuver 30 seconds ago, was now trying to respond to 3 directions of pressure at once. I watched a Grintal formation of several hundred begin to compress, folded on itself. The tactical geometry of it was, I kept looking for the word and kept arriving at the same one. Ugly, not elegant, which not brilliant in the way military historians describe brilliant maneuvers. The sweeping flanks, the elegant double envelopments. This was ugly, close, grinding, and it worked specifically because it was those things, because it had been designed by people who understood that their 14 lives inside a closing trap was not a liability, it was a fulcrum. I set down my logging device, and I picked it back up 6 seconds later because logging is the only thing I know how to do when I don't know what to do. 6 hours, 44 minutes, and 17 seconds. Grintal column. Structural cohesion degraded. Human element 1 confirmed active inside encirclement. Flanking elements applying concurrent external pressure. Outcome. Pending. Pretty much pending. I left it at pending for a long time. The Grintal adapted. I want to say that clearly because I've read accounts of this engagement. Unofficial ones. circulating in certain tactical circles that describe the Grintal as having simply collapsed under human pressure, as if a species that had been systematically dismantling our perimeter for 3 months suddenly forgot how to fight. They didn't forget how to fight. At 7:03, like their command element recognized what was happening to the second column and issued a correction. They pulled their third column back 80 meters, opened a relief corridor to the second, and began a disciplined lateral withdrawal that was, by any standard I can apply, the tactically correct response to what they were facing. It would have worked against anything we had. Reyes was back on the observation deck at 7:04. She had acquired another cup of that burn plant coffee. She looked at the display, saw the Grintal correction, watched the third column open the relief corridor, and made a sound, low, not quite a word, somewhere between acknowledgement and amusement that my translator didn't render at all. I asked, "Does this change your assessment?" She said, "They're good." And then she tapped her comm twice. I logged the tap because I log everything. I had no idea what it meant for another 4 minutes. Timestamp. For what it's worth, 7 hours, 8 minutes, and 29 seconds. The Carver fired. Not at the Grintal columns. Not at the orbital support platforms, which were the targets our own fleet had been trying and failing to engage for 9 days. The Carver fired a targeted pulse at a specific triangular area of Kesari airspace, at an altitude that seemed, on first analysis, to be of no tactical significance whatsoever. I stared at, I guess, the impact coordinates. Produce entière. They had fired at empty air. 7 hours, 9 minutes, and 2 seconds. Kind of I log. Carver discharge coordinates non-standard. No apparent target, and querying tactical justification. Legate Vron appeared at my shoulder. He was looking at the same coordinates. "What is that position?" he asked. I pulled up the overlay. Atmospheric survey, satellite mapping, signal traffic analysis from the past 72 hours. Cross-referenced, collated, ran the projections. At 7 hours, 9 minutes, and 55 seconds, I found it. That, I said slowly, is where the Grintal's weather satellite relay is bouncing their tactical AI's environmental data. Braun was quiet for a moment. "The static model question," he said. The question Reyes had asked in the briefing. The one nobody could answer. Whether the Grintal tactical AI was incorporating live weather data or running on a fixed environmental model. We hadn't known. We had told her we didn't know. She had apparently spent the intervening 2 hours figuring it out. And then she had shot the relay. The Grintal tactical AI was now running blind on weather data, which mattered because I was already pulling the atmospheric forecast, already seeing it. Kesari had a pressure front moving in from the north-northeast. Visibility reduction, electromagnetic interference, the kind of low-ceiling conditions that affected long-range targeting calculation by a factor of 7 hours, 10 minutes, and 17 seconds. Grintal targeting AI now operating on stale atmospheric model. Estimated targeting accuracy degradation, 31 to 44% within 20 minutes as conditions change. Human forces presumably factoring live conditions. I looked at the number I just logged. 31 to 44%. We have been losing a defensive perimeter to these people for 3 months. We have been losing orbital platforms. We have been filing escalating alert recommendations that Legate Vron kept politely declining because the situation, while serious, hadn't yet crossed the threshold that justified requesting human intervention. It hadn't occurred to me. I'm logging this as an honest statement of professional failure. It hadn't occurred to me to ask what the Grintal AI was running on. I've been watching the output of that system for 3 months and hadn't thought to look at its input. Reyes had thought to ask in the first 19 minutes. I set down my coffee. I kind of didn't pick it up again. Plus, it didn't deserve to be picked up. Timestamp. 7 hours and 31 minutes. The weather rolled in at 7:22. It looked from the observation deck like the sky was having second thoughts about the whole day. The light shifted from gray to a flat, pressed tin color that made the Kesari terrain below look like a tactical map of itself. Wind interference flagged on 3 of my external sensors. I noted the time, noted the atmospheric shift, and watched the Grintal targeting data on the display. The Grintal were firing at where the humans had been, not where they had been 16 to 22 seconds prior, which under the actual atmospheric conditions versus the stale model they were working from was the exact error margin I projected. Human element 2 had moved in twice. in the time it took the Grintal system to acquire compute and fire. I do not know if this was planned or instinct. I've asked. Plus, the answers I've received from the humans involved have been, without exception, maddeningly incomplete. One of them told me later in the debrief that they moved because standing still is how you get shot. He said it like it was obvious. Like I'd asked him why water was wet. 7 hours and 31 minutes. Grintal fire consistently displaced from current human positions. Targeting degradation confirmed. Human elements exploiting gap. Exploiting. That was the word I used. It felt technically accurate and personally insufficient. Though to be fair, Grintal third column, the one that had pulled back to open the relief corridor, was now in an interesting position. It had been designed to rescue the second column. The second column was no longer where it had been when that decision was made. The grinding pressure from the human elements had shifted its shape, pushed its eastern flank inward, and the relief corridor was now opening into empty ground 50 meters from anyone it was meant to reach. The third column stopped. I know what it feels like when a formation stops and doesn't know why it stopped. There's a hesitation pattern in the movement data, a fractional spreading at the edges, the tactical equivalent of a sentence that trails off. I'd seen it in coalition forces often enough to recognize it anywhere. The Grintal third column had the shape of a question. Reyes, what I could observe on the display, appeared to have approximately 43 answers prepared. Timestamp: 7 hours, 44 minutes, and 51 seconds. The human didn't met, yet was Corporal De Jong Park. Didn't technically meet him until the debrief. What I observed of him during the engagement was a biosignature on a tactical display, doing things that I kept logging as errors before having to revise those logs when the errors turned out to be the opposite. At 7:31, Park's element, 2 humans, one of the flanking pairs, stopped moving. I logged 7 hours, 31 minutes, and 14 seconds. Element 3 static. Possible casualty, equipment failure, or positional consolidation. Monitoring, and they stayed static for 11 minutes. While TBH, the rest of the engagement shifted around them. While the Grintal third column hesitated, while the atmospheric conditions worsened, while the second column's eastern flank compressed further, and the pressure from elements 1 and 2 maintained. For 11 minutes, 2 humans sat completely still in a Grintal-adjacent sector and didn't appear to do anything. 7 hours, 44 minutes, and 51 seconds. In my opinion, the Grintal command element moved its reserve unit forward. I know why. And the reserve was their stabilization force. The second column's integrity fell below a certain threshold. Doctrine called for the reserve to push through and reinforce. The threshold had been crossed. The reserve moved. They moved directly through the sector where Park's element had been static for 11 minutes. 7 hours, 44 minutes, and 55 seconds. I look, log. Reserve unit moving through grid 7 Tango. Element 3 in immediate path. 7 hours, 45 minutes, and 3 seconds. Something happened in grid 7 Tango that I still haven't fully characterized in my official report, because the technical description is accurate, but sounds, when written plainly, like I'm describing a magic trick. The reserve unit, mid-movement, encountered a series of what the post-engagement analysis classified as improvised directional charges, placed, based on the scorching pattern, during the 11-minute static window, at intervals that forced the formation into a compression and redirect sequence. Not a destruction, a redirect, and into the northern quadrant, where the second column's displaced eastern flank was now sitting, isolated, having been pushed there by 6 hours of grinding pressure. Park's element had spent 11 minutes quietly setting up a redirect corridor for an enemy unit that didn't yet exist where it was going, in terrain. The Grintal thought they had clear-mapped, using equipment that the Bay technician had described as technically illegal in 3 coalition jurisdictions. 7 hours, 45 minutes, and 41 seconds. Reserve unit redirected into contact with displaced second column elements. Fratricide probability high. Grintal command response. Pending. I stare at the word fratricide in my own log. In my opinion, Grintal didn't have a word for fratricide in the military context. Their command structure TBH didn't have fratricide in its doctrine. They had never built protocols for it because they had never needed them. Their formations had never been maneuvered into contact with each other. No one had ever done that to them before. Not in 400 years of documented Grintal engagement history. Timestamp. I think 8 hours and 14 minutes, Leggett Vron said at 8:07, they're withdrawing. He said it like a man reporting something he had watched and was not yet certain he believed. I understood the tone. The Grintal second column had been the load-bearing structure of the offensive. Not because it was the largest or the best equipped. The first column held that distinction. But because it was the hinge, the piece, that connected the ground advance to the orbital fire support timing. The piece that the reserve was built to protect. The piece the third column's lateral withdrawal had been designed to stabilize. The second column was no longer structurally coherent. What it was at 8:07 was a formation in the process of understanding that it was no longer a formation. Units separating from their command positions. Fire lanes disrupted, the reserve that was supposed to reinforce it having been redirected into its own flank and, now, in the process of its own positional crisis. The first sort of column, intact, aware, watching what was happening to its right, began the withdrawal sequence at 8:09. Doctrine, which correct doctrine. When one column collapses, withdraw the adjacent forces before the collapse spreads. The Grintal look, commanders were good at their jobs. Under any other circumstances, that withdrawal would have been the right call, and it would have preserved enough force integrity for a secondary offensive within 72 hours. Reyes didn't let it be that, and I do not fully understand what she communicated or how, because the engagement command architecture the humans operated on was not one-eyed visibility into. Their comm traffic was encrypted in a way that coalition decryption software managed to describe as present without being able to read it, which isn't a thing I'd previously believed was possible. What I think, is that at 8:09, when the Grintal first column began withdrawing, the Carver opened its secondary weapons array. The human ground, in my opinion, elements shifted simultaneously in a way that shouldn't have been possible without a shared positional awareness system I couldn't find evidence of from pressure to pursuit. They didn't pursue to destroy, and they pursued to shape. The first column's withdrawal route had two viable corridors. One led to their forward staging area, which was where they could reconsolidate. The kind of other led east toward terrain that offered cover but no resupply. At 8:14, the eastern corridor was the only one that wasn't being contested. The Grintal first column went east. 8 hours, 14 minutes, and 33 seconds. I log. Grintal first column route constrained to eastern approach. Staging area access denied. Human elements to be fair. Maintaining pursuit pressure. Grintal resupply capability compromised, which the engagement was not over. It would take another hour and 46 minutes of that pursuit, that careful route denying, that shape-making, before the Grintal formally disengaged and pulled back past their own forward line of troops. But the battle, the one that had been happening in various ways for 3 months, was over at 8:14. I knew it at 8:14. I logged it at 8:14. I didn't write that in the submitted report because it seemed presumptuous to declare a battle over before it was finished. What I wrote instead was, assessment, momentum transfer complete, which was the most neutral way I could find to say what I was actually thinking, which was something I didn't have language for yet. The specific feeling of watching something you had believed was intractable simply stopped being intractable. Not because conditions changed, not because reinforcements arrived, not because of some strategic masterstroke that could be diagrammed and studied and replicated. Because 14 people had arrived, looked at the shape of a problem, and made it a different shape. Timestamp, 9 hours, 47 minutes, and 2 seconds. End of engagement. The formal disengagement was logged at 9:47. The Grintal pulled back 11 kilometers. Far enough that our analysts classified it as a tactical withdrawal rather than a repositioning. The orbital support platforms, the ones we hadn't been able to touch, went cold at 9:51, cutting their active emissions in a way that suggested the humans' earlier disruption of the targeting relay had done more than immediate damage. The platforms were now running on degraded data, and they knew it. I logged the end time at 9 hours, 47 minutes, and 2 seconds, cross-referenced it against the beginning of the engagement at 4:47, and had the number in my record before I'd consciously thought about it. 4 hours and 59 minutes from dock to disengagement. I rounded up to 5 in my report, because I've been taught that precision without context is just noise and the precise number felt like it was arguing with itself. Reyes TBH found me on the observation deck at 10:03. She had abandoned the coffee. She was eating something, a compressed food block of some kind, wrapped in material her people apparently used specifically for this. She stood beside me at the forward display, and we both looked at the tactical picture for a moment. The picture was quiet. Quiet the way a room is quiet after something loud has been in it. Not calm, just emptied. Your documentation system, she said eventually. You log everything? Everything, I confirmed. I didn't apologize for it. I never do. She made that sound again, the one my translator didn't render. Up close, I could identify it as something between acknowledgement and amusement, leaning slightly toward the latter. The relay, I said. You knew before the briefing. It wasn't a question. I'd reconstructed pretty much the timing, the question she'd asked, the response options available to her, the speed with which the carver had been positioned. She had walked into that briefing already knowing what question to ask, because she had already, somewhere in transit, begun thinking about what to ask. She didn't confirm or deny it. She bit off a corner of the food block. What did your logs say? She asked. First entry, which when we docked. I looked at my device. 4 hours, 47 minutes, and 41 seconds. Human vessel configuration non-standard. Structural coherence. Unclear. Threat assessment. Pending. I read it to her, flatly, without editorializing. She finished the food block. Pending, she repeated. Yeah. She looked at the display one more time. That's about right. She left the deck. I stood in the coolant smell and the recycled air and looked at my log and thought about updating that entry, the one still marked pending, still unresolved in my system, and decided to leave it. There was something in that word, sitting there unresolved, something that felt more accurate than whatever I'd replace it with. Timestamp, 10 hours, 44 minutes, and 19 seconds. Addendum, personal log. We spent 3 months losing ground, one platform at a time, to an enemy we had extensively documented. We spent 5 hours. I've been filing reports for 31 years. I'm good at my opinion and my job. Plus, look, and I log this without false modesty because false modesty is a waste of record space. Thorough. I track what happens. In my opinion, I track when. I know what, I couldn't predict and why. To be fair, I couldn't predict this. Not the tactics. Not the improvisation in Grid 7 Tango. Plus, not the relay, or the route denial, or the way 14 personnel managed to carry a battle that 42,000 opposing units have been winning for a season. I've been trying to find a category for it. The way you find a category for anything, the organizing principle, the doctrinal framework, the thing and I keep arriving at the same problem. I don't think it's a category. I think the humans brought it pre-categorized, and the category doesn't translate. I one more item to log from the debrief, which ran from 11 to 12:30, and which I attended as official observer. At 12:14, one of the junior analysts, one of ours young, very sharp, the kind of officer who asks good questions, asked Sergeant Reyes what she had considered the greatest risk in the engagement. Reyes thought about it. Genuinely thought. I watched the pause. She said the coffee. The analyst looked at her. It was really bad, Reyes said. I can't think straight on bad coffee. Honestly, that was the variable I was most worried about. 3 people laughed. The analyst who had asked the question was not one of them. He was writing it down. I looked at my own log. 4 hours, 12 minutes, and 7 seconds. Coffee was terrible again. I left the debrief at 12:30, walked back to the observation deck, and looked at the display for a long time. The Grental were 11 kilometers east and still moving. I made one final log entry for the day. 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 2 seconds. Recommend immediate resupply of human-compatible beverage provisions. Priority, high. I'm in it.